Few issues are as politically charged in this country as border protection. And what goes on across Australia's vast maritime borders remains a tightly guarded secret. Australian Defence Force members routinely witness large-scale human degradation and misery. Tonight, for the first time, some of those Australian men and women speak publicly about the traumatic experience of dealing with the surge of asylum seeker boats that reached its peak under the former Labor government. They describe how they've suffered, their mistreatment by Defence, and the political calculations that can determine who lives and who dies at sea. Dan Oakes reports, and a warning, this story contains confronting accounts of maritime interceptions and rescues.
For 13 years, Troy Norris was on the front line of Australia's border protection effort.
I'm the boarding party expert. I'm in charge of all the training on board, all your hand-to-hand combat, your baton training, all your weapon training.
Norris spent much of that time on patrol boats, including this one, HMAS Albany. He intercepted and boarded dozens of asylum seeker vessels.
At the time, you run on adrenaline. You're just trying to do the best you can to get as many people out of the water as quickly as possible. There's so many people in the water, and they all look the same. All you see is a head and a face. That was one of the most difficult aspects of the recovery of people in the water that are alive, was the fact that you're playing God, and I didn't like that too much.
Often Troy Norris faced a different horror, retrieving the dead, including children.
They become quite bloated, very unrecognisable, and there's only one way to pull them in, and that's to grab them and try and chuck them in the boat. And sometimes you'd go to pull these people in the boat, and all you'd end up with is a handful of flesh. You'd just stripped to the bone. And after seeing stuff like that, it's pretty hard to forget.
Norris has been traumatised by his naval experience. He was accidentally shot in a training mishap and blown off an asylum seeker boat when it exploded. He's been diagnosed with PTSD after witnessing unspeakable horrors.
We were heading back into port to offload the bodies and stuff, and walking up the stairs to one deck to go get a coffee and a bit of brekkie, and come across this just pool of human bile, I guess that's the best way I could describe it, because the body bags were not sealed properly, they leaked.
Last year, he suffered a complete mental breakdown.
When Troy called me and said that he'd been taken off the boat and was on suicide watch, he'd had his shoelaces taken off, he's had his bags checked, I was in shock. I didn't know what to think.
After spending 8 weeks in a psychiatric hospital, Norris eventually returned to work, but says he was effectively forced out of the Navy.
Defence-wide, they love you when you're working. As soon as you're broken, you're just a number and a liability, and they can't wait to get you out.
We're very proud of them. They're only about 5 years old.
And so the manoeuvrability...
Under the Labor governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, the number of asylum seekers dramatically increased. In 2007, 148 people arrived by boat. By 2012, the figure was 17,000. Greg served on border security operations as that wave of people swirled. A former officer, he was recently medically discharged with PTSD.
Basically, you are greeted with a sensory overload. You jump on and you can smell 3 days worth of human faeces, you can smell vomit. There are children screaming, there are people, crying, there are people... Desperation, I would say. I'd say maybe 1 in 5 has someone who's deceased. There are other search and rescues where they haven't been found in time, and everyone's dead when you get on there. everyone, and you know, they've been in the sun for a few days as well.
Greg says he witnessed behaviour by asylum seekers that deeply disturbed him.
You know, the amount of times I've had to step in where we've been, you know, supplying food and water to badly dehydrated and malnourished people, and, you know, a cup of water has been snatched from the hand of a child by an older adult male.
Greg recalls one night when he intervened to stop the attempted rape of a young asylum seeker by a man who claimed to be the boy's uncle.
I remember that particular night with a great large amount of detail, because it was just, I became painfully aware that that child was with him for the purpose of his own pleasure.
As Australians celebrated their National Day last year, Greg was involved in an incident that made him question the policies he was meant to enforce.
It was a very hot day. It was up to 45 degrees. We conducted this boarding, steamed the vessel to a buoy off Christmas Island, which it was secured to while we waited for someone to make a decision. But it was determined that, firstly, it wasn't a good look to have a CF arriving on Australia Day. Secondly, there was no one in the office to talk to who had the ability to make the decision without worrying about having to cover their own backside. So as a result, we sat on that boat with upwards of 90 men, women and children in 45-degree heat. These people had already been suffering from carbon monoxide exposure, as well as from the sun and seasickness. And we sat on that boat for 6.5 hours to wait for darkness to fall. So we were then able to unload the people without creating a stir, without the media being able to know all the details of it. And it was a very, very unhappy time.
Michael is a serving Navy member who has worked as a patrol boat officer. Like Greg, he would only talk to 730 on condition of anonymity, and says that people have died because of delays caused by Canberra. He describes an occasion when he was told to wait to board a vessel, with disastrous consequences.
Our vessel was delayed 15 hours for a boarding on one occasion, and we got reports in from surveillance aircraft that that vessel had sunk 13 hours ago, and all we found was probably a line about 70 miles long of bodies. And we fished them out for as long as we could till we were full, and that wasn't uncommon.
He says decisions made by captains he served under were sometimes a result of indirect political influence. Sometimes the results were fatal.
I can remember one instance straight off the top of my head where a struggling boat of Rohingyas halfway to Christmas Island did all they could to comply with the boarding officer's instructions. Then we left them alone. 150 nautical miles from anywhere in a poorly repaired boat.
According to Michael, the captain of the ship said the instruction to leave the first boat came from Canberra, with tragic consequences.
After we rendered the second boat assistance, we went back to where the previous boat was, 150 miles down. There was no sign of it.
Like other sailors 730 spoke to, Michael is haunted by the thought that he and his crewmates sometimes made wrong decisions, and asylum seekers drowned as a result.
I made a mistake that I'm very sorry about, and since making that mistake, I've tried to keep a tally in my head of every life that I feel responsible that I've saved to try to repay this mistake, and that's 978, and it hasn't repaid a cent.
No one hears about the boats that don't make it. No one hears about the recovery of the dead bodies. You know, the only stories you ever hear are, oh, the boat was intercepted and taken to Manus Island or taken to Christmas Island or whatever, you know. It's like the dirty, dark secret that's kept hidden in the closet.
Like Troy Norris, Greg was left with post-traumatic stress disorder and is now heavily medicated.
Officially, there was no support. I've been deploying on Operation Resolute for almost 5 years, and not once did I receive a post-operational psychological screening.
Troy's mate Robbie Finn also spent years on border protection operations and has also been diagnosed with PTSD. He coped by seeing asylum seekers as numbers, not people.
And self-preservation. You know, by that time I just had an absolute gutful of doing this. An absolute gutful. And I just did not care.
On one occasion, after intercepting a boat, Finn counted 55 people on board. The next morning, the head count was one short.
I was talking with one of the crew members, trying to get a count of everybody, and I'd counted 54 people. And so I've gone to this dude and I said, no mate, yesterday, there was 55 people on board this boat, what happened? And he's gone, during the night, one of the blokes fell overboard. 55 it is, 54 it is. Yeah.
Robbie Finn had left the Navy and joined the Army by the time he was crippled by PTSD. Like many other sailors, he began abusing alcohol.
I was back home on leave, and me and my stepbrother, we downed 2 bottles of Jack Daniels together, and I was around at my dad's place, and we were up at, I don't know, yeah, but I was off my trolley. Apparently Matt said something to me. It was just meant out of fun. I took it the wrong way, and I flogged him. I beat him up. And don't remember it at all. And my stepmum and my father sat me down the next day and said, "You've got a problem, go and get help."
Finn eventually sought help for his PTSD and was medically discharged from the Army. For the former and current naval personnel 730 has spoken to for this story, a significant part of their disillusionment stems from the political pressure indirectly applied to men and women on the front line. A woman we'll call Fiona previously worked at Defence Headquarters in Darwin, known as Northern Command. As a serving Navy officer, she cannot be identified.
There were times when we had crews that conducted boardings and saw the state of the vessel, which was largely overcrowded, and they would have concerns for the welfare of the people on board, but they were told they were only to conduct a boarding to deliver necessary equipment. Then they had to disembark and monitor. On one occasion at least, a vessel overturned and people died.
According to Fiona, the Labor government wanted the boats to enter Australian waters before being boarded, so the crew and passengers would be subject to Australian migration law.
That pressure came from Canberra. It was at a time of heightened political pressure leading up to the election, and they didn't want to conduct yet another boarding outside of waters where they would not get a conviction. So there was pressure, certainly from within the operations room at the headquarters, that we were told the Minister himself was standing in Border Protection Command, and he did not want that boat to be boarded.
Former Labor government ministers contacted by 730 categorically denied any such interference. After Labor was ousted by the Coalition in September 2013, according to Fiona, the new turn-back policy deterred asylum seekers from risking their lives, but it simultaneously imperilled those who did try to reach Australia and were caught.
Those boats are generally unseaworthy and overcrowded. To simply turn them back for the sake of policy and put them on those not purpose-built lifeboats is putting women and children in danger, and we could have taken them on board.
All of the current and former Navy personnel who 730 spoke to believe the secrecy surrounding the border protection operations has contributed to their mental anguish.
I would say the secrecy of the operation and the fact that the public has very little information about what these people are actually doing. Essentially, they're the Vietnam veterans of our time.
And for some Navy personnel, the moral dilemmas they faced and the decisions they made will always stay with them.
I, in my heart, knew that things we did weren't necessarily ethical, but at that time I thought that incorrectly that, you know, to think ethically in a situation like that is a bad thing to do, because that's how you end up with a mental health issue. I thought I was immune to it by trying to ignore what I felt inside me when I looked at these people.
Yeah, the only way I could really justify what the only way I could justify what we were doing is I was just saving lives out there, you know, we're stopping people from drowning.
I think that if people really knew what happens out there, that people would probably be held responsible for what happens, and they would be expected to do something to change it. And at the moment, people just bury their head in the sand all the way to the top and just pretend it's not there.
Dan Oakes reporting there with producers Alex McDonald and Sam Clark. The Defence Department says post-operational psychological screening is now mandatory for all Border Patrol personnel. You can see the department's statement in full on our website.